We're in the book of Genesis, currently studying the life of Jacob. Now, last week we got to the part of the story where Laban accused Jacob of stealing his gods, his household idols. So that's where we're going to start off tonight. So turn with me, if you would, to the book of Genesis chapter 31. We're going to read verse number 30. I can understand your feeling that you must go and your intense longing for your father's home. But why have you stolen my gods? Now, remember, Jacob didn't tell Laban that he was leaving. In fact, he was hoping to be back in Canaan before Laban found out that he was even gone. But it didn't work out that way. As soon as he left, then one of the servants that were probably back at the homestead, they went and found Laban, and they told him that Jacob and all of his family had left Haran and were headed back to Canaan. So Laban took off in hot pursuit of Jacob and his family, and he caught up with him 7 days later. But the night before he confronted Jacob, God appeared to Laban in a dream, and he told him to leave Jacob alone. Now, Laban was the leader of his clan, so he brought the whole clan with him. And if the truth be known, Rachel had given Laban the perfect excuse to come after him because she had stolen Laban's idols, his household idols. Now, Jacob didn't know anything about that. So when Laban accused Jacob of stealing his gods, he adamantly denied it, of course. And he told Laban to search his camp. And if he found his gods anywhere in the camp, then the person who had stolen them would be put to death. That's how confident Jacob was that no one in his camp had taken Laban's gods. But if he had only known. You see, he had no idea that Rachel had done this. In fact, no one knew that she had done that except herself. Look at verses 31 and 32. I rushed away because I was afraid, Jacob answered. I thought you would take your daughters from me by force. Now, here's the interesting thing. The only way he could have taken his daughters from him by force was to have killed Jacob. So what Jacob's actually saying here is, I was afraid that you might kill me and then take your daughters away. But as for your God, see if you can find them and let the person who has taken them die. And if you find anything else that belongs to you, identify it before all these relatives of ours, and I will give it back. But Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the household idols. So that's what Laban did. He searched throughout the entire camp, starting with Jacob's tent. Now, why in the world did he start with Jacob's tent? Well, because he was hoping that Jacob was the one that had stolen the gods. That would have given him the perfect excuse to kill Jacob so he could take all of his possessions back with him to Haran. So the very first place that he searched was Jacob's tent. Look at verse 33. Laban went first into Jacob's tent to search there, then into Leah's, and then the tents of the two servant wives. But he found nothing. Finally, he went into Rachel's tent. Now, the suspense is building because we know that Rachel is the one that stole Laban's gods. But no one else knows that. The only one that knows that are the readers because the narrator has told us that. In fact, what's kind of interesting is he's really working up to this because he wants us to actually feel what's taking place and to feel the suspense. Look at verses 34 and 35. But Rachel had taken the household idols and hidden them in her camel saddle, and now she was sitting on them. When Laban had thoroughly searched her tent without finding them, she said to her father, please, sir, forgive me if I don't get up for you. I'm having my monthly period. So Laban continued to search, but he could not find the household idols. Now, she was sitting on the camel saddle, which would have been the perfect place to hide them. So why didn't Laban tell her to get up so he could look into her camel saddles? Why didn't he do that? Does anyone know? It's because she was on her period. In fact, that was the reason that she gave to her father for not standing up when he entered the tent. She was on her period, and the implication is she was cramping. Now, because she was on her period, Laban didn't even think about searching the camel saddle. It didn't even cross his mind. Because in the Middle East, at that time, a woman was considered to be unclean when she was on her period. And anyone or anything that came into contact with her was also considered to be unclean. That's why she was in her tent when Laban came in. She was isolating herself from the rest of the group because she was unclean. And if we don't understand this, then there are many things that happen even in the New Testament that we don't understand. Remember the woman with the issue of blood? when she touched the hem of his garment, she was unclean. She was not supposed to be there because anyone who touched her became unclean until that evening. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 through 24, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Notice what it says. Whenever a woman has her menstrual period, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during that time will be unclean until the evening. So when a woman was on her period, she would actually come in and restrict herself from going out in public. She would also keep to herself so that other people wouldn't touch her. And then it goes further. Anything on which the woman lies or sits during the time of her period will be unclean. If any of you touch her bed, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you touch any object she has sat on, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. This includes her bed or any other object she has sat on. You will be unclean until evening if you touch it. If a man has sexual intercourse with her and her blood touches him, her menstrual impurity will be transmitted to him. He will remain unclean for 7 days, and any bed on which he lies will be unclean. Now, even though this is the Mosaic law, this was also the mentality throughout the Middle East at this time. Any woman who was on her period was considered to be unclean, and anyone who touched her during the day would be considered unclean until the evening. That was why she was in her tent when Laban came in. When Laban went out to search into Jacob's tent, Jacob was outside. When he went into Leah's tent, she was outside. When he went into the other two wives' tents, they were outside. But not Rachel, because Rachel was on her period. She was restricted from being around people. Not only that, but anything she sat on or she lay down on would be considered unclean for 7 days. And if anyone touched her bed or sat or even touched the chair that she was sitting on, they had to wash their clothes and they had to bathe, and they would still be considered unclean until that evening. So when Laban entered her tent and discovered she was on her period, it never even crossed his mind to check her saddlebags, to check her camel saddles, because from his perspective, Rachel wouldn't dare defile the gods by sitting on them, let alone while she was on her period. But that's also how we know that Rachel was not an idolater. You see, a lot of pastors or preachers and even scholars will look at this and say, well, the reason that she stole his household idols is because she was still into idolatry. But people, that's not true, and we know that because of this story. She wouldn't have had done that, because sitting on those household idols while she was on her period would have been a willful act of defilement. And it would have also been a contemptuous rejection of their religious worth and power. You see, if she truly believed that these idols were gods, she would have been too afraid to do what she did. So by her actions, we know that she didn't worship these idols. We also know that she didn't take them because of their monetary value. Sometimes when we think of idols, we think of very precious items, things that were made out of gold or silver. But the truth of the matter is they weren't. In fact, in the Middle East, archaeologists have dug up thousands of household idols. That's right. And guess what they're made out of? Clay, terracotta. So the only reason that Rachel would have taken them was out of spite. It was to get back at her father for the way that he treated her, especially when Leah got to go into the wedding chamber instead of her after 7 years of looking forward to her wedding night. So she was doing this in spite to get back at her father for the way that he treated her and her husband Jacob. So she took the things that he valued the most, the things that symbolized that he was the leader of the clan. You see, Laban was a very prideful man. Not only that, but he wanted to be the only one who was wealthy. And that's one of the reasons he didn't even want his own daughters to prosper. Because he not only wanted to be the leader of the clan, he wanted to be the most successful person in the clan, and he didn't want to share that with anyone. So these idols symbolized and represented him being the leader of the clan, so he was very proud of them. And Rachel couldn't wait to take those to get back at him. Now, this is a great story, but just because it's a great story doesn't mean that it should be included in the Bible. So why do you think that this story was included in the Bible? Well, the reason it's included is to show us just how foolish idolatry really is. Because in this story, Rachel kidnaps Laban's gods. In other words, a mere mortal and a woman on top of that has the ability to kidnap the gods. Now, people, that's ludicrous. In fact, this is the story that the Jews always used to make fun of the pagans who practiced idolatry. And when they looked back at their ancestors who had gotten away from the true religion, the true faith, and had started worshiping idols, they would always go back to this story and they would say how foolish it is to worship idols. How can a mere mortal kidnap a God? Think about that. Who is God? Our God. Could I kidnap God? Would someone come running in and say, Pastor Allen has kidnapped God? But here in this story, that's exactly what Rachel has done. She has kidnapped Laban's gods. Not only that, to top it off, she can desecrate them by sitting on them. Think about it. If something's really valuable, you would go over there and sit on it. The whole reason for sitting on it is because we think of the rear as being unclean, right? So when she took those idols and she put it in her camel saddlebags, we need to understand it wasn't like the saddlebags we picture that we place on horses. If you've watched Westerns, you'd see the saddlebags. They kind of go over the rump of the horse, but they're on the sides. That's not how a camel saddle was back in those days, especially for women. It's kind of a square box, and it's made with leather that would come in, and it would fit around the camel, and you would tie it just like you do a saddle on a horse. But on the top, it was actually flat. And you'd have a big old pillow up there so they could literally sit cross-legged on the camel and ride that way. But it also had pockets that you could put it in. So she was literally sitting on the idols, and to top it off, she did it while she was on her period. Why? Because she was showing contempt towards them. Not only does she have the power to kidnap her father's gods, but she can defy them by not only sitting on them, but being on her period when she sits on them. So do you really think that idols are gods? And that is the conclusion that the Jews came to. And one of the reasons that this story is placed here, to show just how ludicrous it is to be an idolater. And that's why this story, as I said, is put in here. In other words, it wouldn't have been put in here if that wasn't the point. Now, after Laban searched the whole camp and he came up empty, Jacob went on the offensive. Now, you need to understand something about Jacob. Jacob was what we would call a loyal company man. In other words, he never spoke bad about the boss. And let me say something. From a Christian perspective, it doesn't matter how bad your boss is. When you work for that man, you're supposed to be a loyal company man. And so he was a loyal company man. He never really talked bad about his father or about his father-in-law. And think about this. Even when they were ready to leave, and he's going to tell his wives why they're leaving, that is when he begins to tell his wives how bad he's treated them, and this is why he's supposed to leave. But what's interesting is, the implication is he'd never spoken bad about him before. When he had altercations with him, it was face to face. So here we see Jacob leaving. He's cut off his service towards him. But when he comes up empty-handed, doesn't find the household idols, that's when Jacob goes on the offensive. Look at verses 35 through 37. She said to her father, "Please, sir, forgive me if I don't get up for you. I'm having my monthly period." So Laban continued to search, but he could not find the household idols. Then Jacob became very angry. Now, I want you to understand, he continued the search. But when he didn't find anything, Jacob became incensed. And he challenged Laban. "What's my crime?" he demanded. "What have I done wrong to make you chase after me as though I were a criminal? You have rummaged through everything I own. Now show me what you have found that belongs to you. Sit it out here in front of us before our relatives for all to see. Let them judge between us." See, we know the whole clan is there because that's what he's appealing to. All of the family that you brought, you wanted to air this out and be justified in chasing me and bringing all of these possessions back. If If you found something, bring it out for all of us to see. Now, we don't know how long that Laban spent looking for his household idols. All we know is that after the search, completely searching everything, he came up empty-handed. And when he refused to apologize for accusing Jacob of taking his household idols, that's when Jacob finally let him have it in front of everyone, because he's no longer his boss. And now it was time to set this straight, because for all of these years, Laban had made Jacob look bad in front of the entire clan. I want you to notice what Jacob said to Laban. "What's my crime?" he demanded. "What have I done wrong to make you chase after me as though I were a criminal? You've rummaged through everything I own. Now show me what you found that belongs to you. Set it out here in front of us before our relatives for all to see. Let them judge between us." Now again, I want you to keep in mind that he's brought the entire clan with him. So he challenged Laban in front of everyone to show one thing that he's found that belongs to him, and Laban couldn't do it. Because Jacob didn't take anything that didn't belong to him. Now Rachel did, but Jacob didn't have any idea that she'd done that. Now, when Laban couldn't produce even one thing, not just the household idols, remember he took it a step further. He said, in fact, if you find anything that belongs to you, then I'll give it back to you. But when he couldn't produce even one thing, Jacob finally went on the offensive. And in front of the whole clan, he exposed just how unscrupulous Laban really was. You see, most of the clan thought that the reason Jacob had become so wealthy was because of Laban. And of course, that was the impression that Laban was always giving people. He was always giving the impression that, yes, I've made this wealth on my own, and yes, I've taken in my nephew, and he's married my daughters, and I've been good to him, and notice how much wealth he has possessed. And he was always giving the impression that it was because of him. But the truth is, we know the truth because Moses has told us. The truth is, Laban had done everything in his power to keep Jacob from prospering. So Jacob finally decided to expose Laban for the fraud that he really was. He wanted the clan to see, because it was for their own good, just what kind of leader Laban really was. So he began telling the clan just how bad Laban had treated him over the last 20 years, and it had to have been embarrassing to Laban because he exposed him as a fraud. Let's read verses 38 through 42, and then we're going to tear it apart. "For 20 years I have been with you, caring for your flocks. And all that time your sheep and goats never miscarried." Now, what he's meaning by that is a lot of shepherds were lazy. And if they were giving birth during the middle of the night, they just continued to sleep. But a good shepherd would get out there and would help them give birth. And so he's saying that he was always caring for the flocks, and your sheep and your goats never miscarried. "And all those years I never used a single ram of yours for food. If any were attacked and killed by wild animals, I never showed you the carcass and asked you to reduce the count of your flock. No, I took the loss myself. You made me pay for every stolen animal, whether it was taken in broad daylight or in the dark of night. I worked for you through the scorching heat of the day and through cold and sleepless nights. Yes, for 20 years I slaved in your house. I worked for 14 years earning your 2 daughters, and then 6 more years for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. In fact, if the God of my father had not been on my side, the God of Abraham and the fearsome God of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen your abuse, and he's also seen my hard work. That is why he appeared to you last night, and he rebuked you." Wow. What Laban had done to Jacob over the last 20 years went against all of the laws and the customs at that time. You see, shepherds were allowed to feed their family from the flock, but Jacob never did that. He told the clan, "In all those years, I never used a single ram of Laban's for food." Not only that, if a wild animal killed one of the lambs or goats, all the shepherd had to do was show the carcass, and he wasn't held responsible for it. But that wasn't the case with Laban. Notice what Jacob told the clan. "If any were attacked and killed by wild animals, I never showed you the carcass and asked you to reduce the count of your flock. No, I took the loss myself because I knew what kind of man you were. You told me right from the beginning. It didn't matter. If it happened on my shift, then I would be held responsible for it. If a lamb or a goat was stolen at night, the shepherd wasn't supposed to be responsible as long as he had taken adequate preparations or precautions. But notice what Jacob told the clan. Laban made me pay for every stolen animal, whether it was taken in broad daylight or not. If it happened in dark of night, it didn't matter. Laban still made me pay for it. Now, you need to understand something. The whole clan, this is what they do for a living. Now, imagine when you've got all of these blue-collar workers and they're listening to this and they're going, do what? That's not what Laban's been telling us. And to top it off, Laban changed his wages 10 times. Now, that's really a figure of speech. There's been a lot of scholars and a lot of pastors that try to go through the story and count all the things that he did to try and come up to 10 times that he changed his wages. But you need to understand that that's a figure of speech. It would kind of be like us saying, well, that happened umpteen times. How many of you ever said umpteen times? How much is umpteen times? It's a lot. Well, that's what this means. He changed my wages 10 times. Now, people, that was totally unethical in that culture. Once a wage was agreed upon, you were expected to live up to it. But Laban didn't do that. Why? Because his word wasn't any good. Notice what Jacob told the clan. Yes, for 20 years I slaved in your house. I worked for 14 years earning your 2 daughters. And then 6 more years for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. But he saved the worst for last. The worst thing that Laban did, the worst thing that he was guilty of, was that he was going to send Jacob and his daughters away empty-handed after Jacob had fulfilled his duty as a steward. Do you remember that? And we found out at that time that if someone came in and they worked for you for an agreed amount of time for a specific thing, that when it was over and he fulfilled his obligation or fulfilled his duty, you were supposed to bless him and make sure he didn't go out empty-handed. And this was the worst thing that you could do. And so he actually comes out, and this is what he accuses of him of. Notice what he tells the clan. In fact, if the God of my father had not been on my side, the God of Abraham and the fearsome God of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed. Now, at that point, Laban is totally humiliated because all of his family members are shepherds. This is what they do. They work in the fields, but the majority of their wealth comes from having these flocks and from breeding this. And so they're listening to this, and Laban is totally humiliated. So what does he do? Well, he does what every guilty person does when all the facts are coming out. He tries to defend himself. Notice what he said in verse number 43. But this is also when he makes his Freudian slip. Because now he has to respond, and when he starts responding, he gets in the middle of it, and all of a sudden, something slips out. Look at the first part of verse 43. Then Laban replied to Jacob, these women are my daughters. Now you need to understand why he's saying this. These children are my grandchildren. He's actually playing to the clan. He wants the clan to go, I wouldn't treat them like this. You're making me to be out to be this really bad guy. But these women are my daughters. These children are my grandchildren. You guys don't think I would really be this way? But as he's defending himself, he makes a slip up. And I kind of believe that the Holy Spirit caused him to do that because he could have denied it all and people would have gone, boy, Jacob sure made a good case, but you know, Laban did too. Laban's saying that's not true. So here's what's interesting. As he says this, he replies to Jacob, these women are my daughters, these children are my grandchildren, and then he makes the slip. And these flocks are my flocks. In fact, everything you see is mine. Now, at this point, the whole clan is shaking their heads. Now, depends on who they were. Because if you go to Turkey, you need to understand that this means no and this means yes. So if you go to Turkey sometime and you're wanting to know something, you say, is that right? And they do this, that means yes. If they do this, it means no. And a lot of people have bought things they shouldn't have bought. So I want you to understand that Haran is up there where it would be Syria and kind of modern day Turkey. Of course, it wasn't the Turks then. But I'm assuming as he's saying this, they begin shaking their heads because they're thinking, I don't think so, Laban. If everything Jacob's saying is true, and we don't hear you denying it, then everything here is his, it's not yours. And that's why Laban says what he does in the last part of verse number 43 and verse number 4, because when that slipped out, he hung himself. And that's when they go, oh, if the best you've got is these are your daughters and these children are your grandchildren, and you wouldn't do anything, but you're not denying what he said, and now we heard you say that all of this is his, now he's got the union against him. So notice what Laban has to say in the last part of verse 43 and in verse 44. Well, what can I do now about my daughters and their children? Now he's back on that, playing the sympathy card. So come, let's make a covenant, you and I, and it will be a witness to our commitment. Going back to that sympathy, but I want you to notice, there's no sorry. There's no apology. In fact, to try and throw suspicion back on Jacob, he proposes that he and Jacob needs to make a covenant. And he proposes this under the pretense that he can't trust Jacob. He can't trust him to treat his daughters right. And he can't trust him to remain peaceful. And that's why they need to make this covenant. So let's read verses 44 through 55. So come, let's make a covenant, you and I, and it will be a witness to our commitment. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a monument. Then he told his family members, gather some stones. So they gathered stones and they piled them in a heap. Then Jacob and Laban sat down beside the pile of stones to eat a covenant meal to commemorate the event. Laban called the place Jegar Sahadutha, which means witness pile in Aramaic. And Jacob called it Galid, which means witness pile in Hebrew. Then Laban declared, this pile of stones will stand as a witness to remind us of the covenant we have made today. This explains why it was called Galid, witness pile. But it was also called Mizpah, which means watchtower. For Laban said, may the Lord keep watch between us to make sure that we keep this covenant when we are out of each other's sight. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you marry other wives, God will see it, even if no one else does. He's a witness to the covenant that we're making today that's between us. See this pile of stones, Laban continued, and see this monument I've set between us? They stand between us as a witness of our vows. I will never pass this pile of stones to harm you, and you must never pass these stones or this monument to harm me. I call on the God of our ancestors, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of my grandfather Nahor. Because Abraham and Nahor didn't see eye to eye. Nahor was an idolater. He believed in many gods. But Abraham brought monotheism in. He believed in one true God to serve as a judge between us. So Jacob took an oath before the fearsome God of his father Isaac to respect the boundary line. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice to God there on the mountain and invited everyone to a covenant feast. Now you need to understand, he made a sacrifice to God, and God here in the Hebrew is singular, to the one true God, the God of his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac, and now his God. And then they invited everyone to a covenant feast. After they had eaten, they spent the night on the mountain. Laban got up early the next morning, and he kissed his grandchildren, his daughters, and he blessed them. And I'm sure he made a big show of it so he could stick back into the graces of the clan and show that he really loved them. Then he left and returned home. Now, as I said, the only reason that Laban proposed to make this covenant was to save face. Because Laban knew that Jacob was a man of integrity. Jacob had worked for him for 20 years. And again, when you look at all the things that he did that was wrong towards Jacob, Jacob still worked for him. He was still a loyal company man. So Laban knew that he was a man of integrity. He knew that he was a good husband and a good father, and that he would never abuse any of his wives or children. In fact, he wouldn't even be a bigamist I guess it'd be polygamous because they had more. He wouldn't even be that if it wasn't for his father-in-law. So this was really a slap in the face. This was really throwing mud at his character. But Jacob didn't care. What's interesting about this is he could have said, I'm not going to make a covenant with you. You can't be trusted anyway. But he didn't do that. You see, Jacob was willing to do whatever it took to end things peacefully. So he was more than willing to do it. And that's a lesson to us too. Many times we want to be right. Before we're going to come in and do this, we're going to make sure everyone knows, and we're going to air all of this out, and then I'm still not going to do it. You see, Jacob wasn't that way. He was a peacemaker. And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the what? And when will they inherit it? During the millennium. During the millennium. When you truly want to inherit it. We don't want to inherit it now when our life is only 70 to 80 years long. People, we want to inherit the earth during eternity. And we're going to inherit the earth during the millennium, and then again, that this old heaven and earth is going to pass away, and God will create a new heaven and earth, and that's the new earth for those who are peacemakers. And here is Jacob, a peacemaker. And it doesn't matter that he knows that this is a farce. It doesn't matter that really he can't trust Laban anyway. If this will bring peace, then we will make the covenant. And here's what's interesting. When they make this covenant and they provide the feast, the ceremonial covenant meal, whose animals are being slaughtered? Jacob's. Does Laban pay for them? The story doesn't say. But we can guess, as we looked at all the accusations that were made against Laban, that it was Jacob who provided everything. Why? Because he was a peacemaker. So they made the covenant. Now, what's funny to me is that Laban's suspicious and hypocritical statement in verse number 49 has been taken out of context, and today it's used as a token of love. How many of you know what a Mizpah coin is? How many of you wore a Mizpah coin pendant when you were in high school and you had your girlfriend, or if you're a girl, you had your boyfriend? How many of you don't know what a Mizpah coin is? Okay, all right. Todd would like to show you Meg's jewelry, and there's Nolan's jewelry too, and so we'll just make a little spiel here. Some of you have probably called it a half-heart, but it's a pendant that has verse number 49 out of Genesis chapter 31 stamped on it. And here's what it says. The Lord watch between me and thee. Let me go ahead and turn this. Me and thee when we are absent one from another. Doesn't that sound great? So if you've got a boyfriend, a girlfriend, and maybe you're even married, and you just want to spend all your time with them, and they're going to be gone for a week, maybe to training, or maybe they're in the military and they're leaving, you go down to the jewelry store and you buy this Mizpah coin. And on it is stamped this: the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one for another. And you think, oh my, that is so nice. But here's what's interesting. They stamp this on a coin, and then they cut it in half, and then each one wears half of it. Because you're only half a person when they're gone. Right? But when you get back together, you can take the Mizpah coins in their half, and you can put it together, and there's that verse that's there. Now, here's what's funny. Verse number 49 that's stamped on the Mizpah coin has nothing to do with love. In fact, these two people hate each other. It's basically saying, I can't watch everything you do, but God can. And he's watching you. And when we're apart and you're trying to scheme and think how you can wipe me out and do something harmful to me, I just want you to know that God is watching. And if you cross this Mizpah is a watchtower. If you cross this Mizpah, God will see it and he will judge you. So you better not do anything evil to me. So the next time your son or your daughter is dating someone and they get a Mizpah coin, you say, well, you just tell them that what you're actually saying in this, I can't watch you all the time, but if you cheat, gotta know. If you want to put something over on me, gotta know. If you're not treating me right, gotta know, even if I don't know. And that's what this is actually saying.